Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you may be, and happy Biodiversity Day. Welcome to our webinar on exploring the interconnections of human rights, biodiversity, and sustainable development in Asia. My name is Tromsap Wachiratanakorn from UN Human Rights, and I'm honored to moderate this important discussion co-organized by UN Human Rights and Women for Biodiversity in recognition of the International Day for Biological Diversity 2025 under the theme Harmony with Nature and Sustainable Development. Today, we will examine the critical connections between biodiversity, human rights, and sustainable development, guided by our distinguished panel of experts. Our first panelist, Mr. Surya Deva, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development. Our second panelist, Mr. Benjamin Chatter, Coordinator of Environment and Climate Change Unit, UN Human Rights. And last but not least, Ms. Rainalini Wright, Director of Women for Biodiversity. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. This session is recorded and will be live streamed on YouTube. Please keep your microphone mute unless you are speaking, and please submit your question via chat. In our Q&A session, we will cover as many as possible. And please also now introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where are you joining from. So let's dive into our discussion. I have one question, the kickstart question for all speakers. What is the most urgent human rights challenge related to biodiversity in the world today? I want to start with Surya first. You have 2 minutes only.
Thank you, Romchat. Thank you for bringing this together, this webinar, and bringing us together. So pleasure to do it with Ben and Mernalini. From my perspective, the key challenge I see is that biodiversity is seen merely a means for an end by human beings. So biodiversity is not seen as actors who have rights on their own. Biodiversity is not seen as something that has its own agency. Rather, it is becoming merely a commodity for exploitation and for the so-called economic growth and unsustainable development. So to me, that is a major concern that I see. And that basically means that we are completely ignoring the rights of the nature. So nature has its own independent rights, and increasingly we see that recognition. But if you look at the human rights discourse, that unfortunately remains very human-centric. And that's why even when we are talking about the rights of future generations, we are limiting ourselves to rights of human beings or needs and interests of human beings. And that is where I'm trying to remind states and the other actors that don't merely say, leave no human being behind. What about if we leave behind plants, animals, forests, and mountains? So we have to take them along with us. And I think that I see a major challenge in terms of a shift in the mindset. Thank you.
Thank you, Lima Surya. What about you, Ben? In your view, what is the most urgent human rights challenge related to biodiversity in our world?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And first, I'd just like to say I think the reference that Surya just made to the rights of nature discourse is really an important one and an interesting one to think about from a human rights perspective and in the context of human rights law. And so when we think about the challenges that we have right now in terms of biodiversity with respect to human rights, we see precisely this disconnect and particularly between the people that are in power and nature, and viewing nature as something to exploit rather than something to protect. I think that the combination of unsustainable consumption and production and unequal distribution of resources that we have at a global level right now is fundamentally driving the biodiversity crisis and exacerbated by that disconnect between people and nature contributing to human rights violations. The human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, recognized by the UN General Assembly in its resolution 76/300, gives us a tool to think about humanity as part of nature, to bring together environmental law and human rights law. And it really clarifies that it's an obligation of all states under international human rights law to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to a healthy environment, but also to respect nature. And I think the interpretation of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in this regard, which recognizes nature itself as something with rights in the context of the human right to a healthy environment, is a really important starting point for us to build on that discourse and some of the issues that Surya raised. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Then I ask the same question to Tina. Tina, you represent the civil society organization, and you also work a lot with the communities, especially from the global south. In your view, what is the most urgent human rights challenge that relate to biodiversity?
Thanks, Ramcha. Thanks, Ben and Surya, for setting the stage. I think my response also be very much corresponding to what both of them talked about, especially also in the context of Asia or the global south, right? I think the pressure to for economic development, I think, is one of the drivers of what the practices or policies or development models that are impacting our region. So, for example, like Surya and Ben talked about the sustainable consumption production part of that, the just transition discussions that are impacting. Those policies are not somewhere on the West, but a majority of those solutions that people are looking at are impacting most of the diverse key biodiversity areas in this region, right? So, and I think what it also really demands for is that around, say, for example, the CBD, right? The theme is very well, living in harmony with nature. But I think we also really forget that there's a very thin line, right, between building that harmony with nature and where Ben also talked about the aspirations, where the wealth is. So how do you really balance wealth versus this living in harmony with nature and having this so-called transformative model? And within that, in the context of Asia, Ramchat, you also know about it, is that we have so much of projects that are impacting. Say, for example, our region, I'm taking the whole of Asia Pacific, has some neoliberal development models which actually do not work neither in the favor of nature nor in the favor of people, right? So you're talking about resource loss, where one of the biggest issues around here is dams. It's clean energy, but it also impacts biodiversity, plants, species, people, communities. And you're also talking about mining, right? Mining for resources. And you're also looking at things like palm oil plantations, right? And we're always talking about that plantations are not forests. They are green, but they do not replace the diversity of species or the ecosystem that it brings about together. Now, within that context, you're talking about the nature as being the rivers, the mountains, the marine, the people also, their rights. Like I said, in the work of the CBD, now there's a lot of work around Article 8, GIVT and traditional knowledge and of indigenous peoples and local communities. And I may be a bit more forward of saying that we're talking about recognizing the rights also of nature and of the people. We in this region, we do also lack recognition by the states of the rights of indigenous peoples in particular into the traditional knowledge to conservation models, and versus also in part of that, I will put this also is on women's rights. No, so I think there's a bit compounding effect of how do we really balance this model where it looks at not leaving no one behind, but this rush to also hamper the best technology and looking at what does economic development look like. So we have a few challenges, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Ramjad.
Thank you very much, Tina, and all speakers to share with us in your view the more challenged human rights and biodiversity issue in the world today. I have some more questions for each speakers it is to introduce the audience about human rights and biodiversity in our world today. I want to start this time with Tina, because you just share some real-life example of biodiversity loss that impact communities in the global south in Asia. But in your view, what overlooked aspect of biodiversity protection that deserves more attention in human rights discussions? Anything that have less attention at this moment, which you feel like we have to discuss more?
Yeah, I think both, and I think those are coming a bit closer, and I think Ben has also been there, is where I think there is a growing connections between the work around biodiversity and human rights and sustainable development, because part of this whole package around building synergies between these other international commitments. But I think one of the challenges I will definitely say is that translating that into the implementation phase, right? You have Human Rights Council resolution, the General Assembly resolutions, a lot of the work around it. But I think it's about time. I'm just talking about the biodiversity, right? It's already been 2 years now, over 2 years since the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has been adopted, which has got a very strong reference on human rights and right to a clean, healthy, sustainable development. It has a very strong link with saying that how do we really also align and support the implementation or achieving the aspiration of the SDGs. But I think the baseline again is that at the national level implementation, sometimes it gets very difficult to translate those policies in practice. And once again, I'm talking about where both Surya and Ben talked about is pursuit of rights, right? Rights of nature, rights of people. And I think we still really need to engage within that space itself, is how do you really operationalize these key terminologies that states will take upon themselves to then actually implement it in its whole aspiration, not just only like in piecemeal, where you're talking about, say, for example, participation, right? I always tell people that participation of numbers of women 50% is not an indicator of empowerment, right? So what are those kind of indicators of action that will actually show that commitment is actually being achieved? So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tina. You just mentioned the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and we might have some audience who doesn't know what it is. So I want to ask this question to Ben. Ben, what is the global framework, like Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework? And you also mentioned the General Assembly resolutions on the right to the healthy environment. How can these global frameworks can be strengthened to ensure that biodiversity actions align with human rights?
Yeah, thank you very much. So the Global Biodiversity Framework is a universally agreed framework for protection of biodiversity that was negotiated at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it includes a set of targets for 2030 and a long-term vision for 2050. And the Global Biodiversity Framework is actually a very strong environmental instrument from a human rights perspective. It sets out very clearly that its implementation should follow a human rights-based approach, respecting, protecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights. It acknowledges the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and the right to development. It highlights the need to ensure gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls and reduce inequalities. It has a number of specific targets which reference human rights, including targets related to the human rights of indigenous peoples over their lands, territories, resources, and knowledge. Its target 22 deals with the rights to access information, to participation in decision-making, and to access justice, and the full protection of environmental human rights defenders. And its target 23 focuses on gender equality. So there's quite a strong instrument. This is not a legally binding instrument, but read together with international human rights law and treaties and understanding how they apply to the context of biodiversity action, it's very clear that a human rights-based approach to biodiversity action is required, both from a legal perspective as well as from an ethical perspective and an effectiveness perspective, right? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has also come out with a number of findings related to the importance of human rights-based biodiversity action. In terms of how do we strengthen implementation of the framework, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. One thing is resources, right? We need to mobilize resources to protect biodiversity at a scale sufficient to prevent the biodiversity crisis from negatively impacting people's rights and from deepening, and to remedy the negative impacts that have already occurred. We also need to ensure coherence. So the biodiversity framework is only as strong as the efforts that are going to be taken at a national, regional, national, local, and community level to implement it. And one key tool for implementation is the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. OHCHR, working with the UN Environment Management Group, has put together clear guidance on integrating human rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And ensuring that that's actually done is critical. And that starts with the actual drafting and the process of developing these plans, right? Ensuring that people's rights to participate are respected in the process of preparing the plan, and ensuring that throughout the development, implementation, and monitoring and reporting on the plan, there's transparency, inclusiveness, and participation. The last thing I'll flag is that the monitoring framework is incredibly important, and the monitoring framework for the Global Biodiversity Framework, too many frameworks in there, is not yet done. And there are parts of it which have been adopted. There's an ongoing discussion related to other parts of it. And unfortunately, some of the targets that most implicate human rights, as well as Section C of the framework, which includes the principles and the human rights-based approach, are not part of or do not have human rights indicators that have been adopted with respect to them. And we need to continue to work and are working to try to address that, to support that, sort of what's measured is often what's acted on. So to support the implementation, we need to keep fighting for a stronger monitoring framework from a human rights perspective. Thank you, Ramchat.
Thank you, Ben. Seems like a lot has to be done. So my last question for this round is to Surya, because coincidentally, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but both Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and Sustainable Development Goals try to achieve the target and goals in 2030, which is only 5 years ahead. How these two frameworks connect to each other and how we accelerate the action. In your view, can we really achieve the targets and also achieve sustainable development goals by 2030? Thank you.
Thanks, Ramchat. I think as Ben highlighted, a lot more needs to be done. The framework, the global biodiversity framework is a good starting point. But that is a framework at 36,000 feet. So how do we operationalize it at the national level, and go beyond national level, at the provincial level, at the city level, at the village level, right? What a human rights-based approach to preserving and conserving and restoring biodiversity should look like in practice. And I think that is where the complementary relationship between this framework and the SDGs is quite crucial. When we look at SDGs, the 17 goals, often we may look at SDG 15 because that's where you will find more references to biodiversity. But I will suggest that biodiversity is crucial to each and every sustainable development goal. Let me take a couple of examples to make my point. The SDG 1 is about poverty, right? We need to eliminate poverty. But how do we eliminate poverty where billions of people are relying directly on biodiversity for their livelihood? And these are not merely indigenous peoples. There are other farmers and other communities who rely heavily on biodiversity to survive and earn their livelihood. So if we have to overcome poverty, we have to ensure that the biodiversity is preserved. Same applies to SDG 2, hunger. If we have to end hunger, a lot of people rely on biodiversity for food, access to nutritious food that is there. Or if we talk about gender equality, SDG 5, where the Mrinalini's point about women for biodiversity comes into picture, right? Where are women? So if the biodiversity is lost, women are disproportionately impacted because unfortunately in patriarchal societies in Asia and elsewhere as well, they bear the burden of taking care of the food and water and all these resources. So they definitely going to impact. And of course, we can go on and talk about SDG 14 about climate change. So my point is that we should not see biodiversity merely in relation to SDG 15. Rather, we should see this as a cross-cutting issue for all the SDGs, and vice versa. If we have to apply a human rights-based lens, I mean, from the perspective of my mandate, right to development, if we have to, let us say, approach it from that particular perspective, because often biodiversity is suffering because of the current model of economic development. And that's why, as part of my mandate, I'm trying to promote an alternative model of development, which is planet-centered participatory model of development. So in this ecosystem approach, human beings and biodiversity and everything else, we are part of the wider ecosystem. And there is an interdependence. And I think that ecosystem approach is the better approach. But it's not merely about that, it's about participation, not consultation, participation of people, because then they have agency and power. And right to development articulates that the participation should be active, free, and meaningful. And often that is not happening. You mentioned, Romchat, in the beginning, the indigenous peoples, right? So when we talk about FPIC, that is not taking place when those decisions are taken, right? So participation is crucial. But equally crucial is intergenerational equity, something that we have not talked about yet, right? So biodiversity is not merely for the present generation. How do we preserve the biodiversity that the future generations can also benefit out of the biodiversity, but also there will be future generation of biodiversity, not merely of human beings, right? So that intergenerational equity aspect is absolutely crucial, and that's where the right to development brings that value. And my last point, and here I would like to connect with what Ben mentioned earlier about resources. We need resources. Definitely, I agree with that. But at the same time, the issue is that often those resources are being spent somewhere else. So the world is seeing a tremendous amount of conflicts all over the world, right? So we don't have lack of resources, but the resources are being used to fight and fund a war economy, in my view. Those resources should be used to preserve the biodiversity or to finance the climate mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage issue. And that's where also the principle of CBDR becomes relevant, common but differentiated responsibilities, because we cannot expect the same level of resources that could be mobilized by developing countries or LDCs or SIDS, and that's where the contribution of not only companies but developed countries that have created a lot of negative impact on biodiversity, they have to bear the burden, as the polluter pays principle applies here in the situation as well. So I'll pause here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ria. Also, Ben and Tina, for walk us through your insights about what is the real connection between human rights, biodiversity, and sustainable development, SDGs. Many food for thought for now, but we also want to hear from the audience as well. We want to engage with you and we want to ask you the question. So we prepare a poll that will appear on your screen now. And we want to hear your opinion about what you believe that would be the biggest impact on human rights and biodiversity. You see, we have 4 options on the screen. In your view, what will be the biggest impact? The first option, stronger legal protection for environmental human rights defenders. Second option, greater corporate accountability. The third option, more secure indigenous peoples and local community rights. And the fourth option, meaningful participation of all stakeholders in the national biodiversity strategies and action plans and others. So please let us know, in your view, what is the biggest impact among these options, the 4 options we proposed, and if you have other options that you want to share. But while we are waiting for the poll result for the input, I want to ask all the speakers, among the 4 options, what will be your answer? I start with Tina first.
Oh no, I thought I'll go last. I'm looking at the poll, and it's really interesting that actually they all are almost at the same par. It is a really very complex issue, and I think I would agree with the poll actually. So it's literally the same. So I think from my perspective, we need to not do like a one track, but because we also come from diverse agencies and diverse civil society organizations. So I think one thing that we've always been now promoting is how do we really also work with each other? Because we all have different capacities and different technical expertise, right? So how do we not like only look at one pathway, but build more collective collaborations across movements, across our allies and movements, to see how we could be together as part of a larger work, right? You're talking about here, like I think defenders is a really very important aspect, but I also see that for corporate responsibility is also very core, because right now the impact of resources that it's going to be needing, these are again terminologies. Say, for example, in the CBD, discussing on digital sequence information, genetic resources, right? So for me, that's a scary part. You talk about indigenous peoples, you need to have their recognition of their rights to the lands and territories. And also NBSAPs, like Ben talked about. So I think they're all varying degrees. So it's just to identify that how do we all look at our strengths and work collectively together to literally approach it in the systematic and inclusive manner. So sorry, I couldn't rate any one of them because we work in all of them, but I think, but the core element I think would be also the NBSAPs, because like Ben said, those are the key document, the national level, that is governments pass it through their agencies, which basically builds the blueprint for national policies, right? So for this CBD, but I think we all together. More confusing response, I think. I couldn't choose. Thanks, Ramcha.
Then I asked Ben, what is your answer?
Well, I'm with Tina and thinking these are all absolutely critical steps that need to be taken. The survey, however, is cruel and only allows you to select one option. So I did complete the survey, and I picked, on this occasion, corporate governance. And it might be that I would pick something else on a different day because they're all really, really critical. But let me say a little bit about corporate accountability. I think, the perpetrators of environmental crises are predominantly coming from a result of the pursuit of wealth without proper or effective regulation of that wealth. This GDP-driven growth model that Surya referenced earlier. And the reality is that businesses, in many cases, are creating vast environmental harm and profiting from it because effective regulations are not in place to stop this and to price in or ensure that the polluter pays, right? That the responsible actor who creates a harm actually has to pay for it. And that problem, I think, is integral to the entire panoply of multiple planetary crises, right? Pollution, biodiversity, climate change. And it is something that can be addressed through regulation, through stronger corporate accountability. And it also relates to the other options we could have selected. For example, protection of environmental human rights defenders. A great deal of the harms experienced by environmental human rights defenders relate to their interaction with private sector actors who often act with impunity and are not effectively regulated or held to account for those actions when they are engaging in different activities. The extractives industry, I think, is a key example of some of these problems, right? Extractives industry historically has been involved with widespread environmental harm, displacement of people, particularly indigenous peoples, and extrajudicial killings by both private and state security forces in different contexts. I could go on, but I'm supposed to be short, so I'll stop there. But just to say, they are all related, they are all important, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how Surya has wrestled with this impossible task that you've given us to choose one.
Yes, sorry, I know my question is very difficult, but Surya, my question to you as well. Before taking this mandate as the special rapporteur on the right to development, you were the special rapporteur on the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. What is your view? Do you agree with Ben, or what is your answer to my questions?
I think your survey was like serving us a buffet where there are a lot of interesting dishes, and you tell us, oh, you can only pick one dish. But interestingly, like Ban, I picked corporate accountability. Why I picked it, and I think Ban already started explaining that, similar explanation. For me, business and human rights or corporate accountability is not just one domain. For me, it is a cross-cutting issue. I often remind people that business and human rights is no longer a field. It is a lens to approach anything in the world, because businesses are controlling everything in the world, what we do, what we don't do. So I think even the other options on your survey, whether it is protecting the environmental human rights defenders, or it is about participation and protecting the rights of landowners and indigenous peoples, or it is about even NBSAPs. In my view, corporates are having significant lobbying power when these policies are being developed at the national level, right? So if the legislation or these policies are weak, one of the reasons they are weak is because of the corporate lobbying behind the scene, and the governments are not acting decisively. So, so I think I ended up selecting corporate accountability for this region. And let me end with this. I'm also increasingly worried about the narrative around the nature, which is like going to commodify nature as well, because we're talking about nature capital. So, as if nature is a capital that is going to be traded and listed on the stock exchange, and more money is going to be made out of it, right? So, corporates and businesses are very good of building a very counterproductive and non-human rights friendly narrative of something which is a good starting point. And I think that's where we need to challenge this corporate power and how they create a narrative which is completely contrary to the original intent, because we start with nature, protecting the nature and all this, and then we move about nature capital. So I think, and that's where corporates come into picture. Thank you.
Ramchat, you're muted.
Sorry very much, Ria. It's always happened. So now we are very excited to see the post. As Mina did us, the most option that receive the highest score is the meaningful participation of all stakeholders in the NBSAPs. Very interesting as well. So I want to hear from the three of you, what will be the barriers in terms of the meaningful participations? Because as we clearly see, it's really resonate most with the audience. What is the barrier of meaningful participation in your view? I
You
go
want
with
me to
Tina.
start? If colleagues don't mind, I can start very quickly.
Oh, okay, please.
In fact, one of my reports next year is going to be on participation in development. That how do we ensure active, free, and meaningful participation in decision-making processes, and that will, of course, capture decisions about preserving the biodiversity and nature as well. The challenges I see, access to information is not there. People don't have access to information, or the information that is shared is highly technical. So even educated people can't understand that particular information. Then there is a corporate lobbying or corporate capture of the decision makers that is there. Then we have shrinking civic space, So there are multiple barriers, and often people are pitted into this situation that if they are fighting for biodiversity, they are labeled as anti-national, or you are anti-development, So you are a nuisance as a civil society because you don't want the country to grow. So I think those narratives make it very challenging for people to meaningfully participate. I'm sure Mrinalini and Ben will add to that, but I will stop here for now.
Thank you. Tina, what is your view on this?
I think Surya has already talked about quite some kind of concrete ones. One thing that I really want to stress out that Surya talked about, and very relevant, which we see in our work, right, is how do you also really transform its access to information, but we really need capacity building of these terminologies, right? Because like say, for example, the SDGs, goals, action targets, HRBA, just these terminologies, to be honest, sometimes gets very limited to also a very select few, right? Like even I'm a technical person, but sometimes I'm still struggling with new terminologies that come about, right? Like digital sequence information, I have no idea what it is. I need to read a lot about it. So we're really talking about participation of whole of society. We also really need to recognize that the whole of the larger society do not have access to information or even facilities like internet to access information, to Google it. Right, so that's a larger sector. So how do you really mobilize? When we say big words like whole of society approach is very important, but what is really important for us to identify is what are the enabling conditions to make it happen, Again, the access to information and the engagement part, again, gets very limited to the privileged ones, right? So this is like a process, a continuation process. And also, I think one of the challenges I would also see is that for meaningful participation, what everybody's also been talking about is resources, right? So you also need to make sure that there are resources available for those sections of communities to also come and engage. It could be like I says, the enabling conditions, right? Like even attending meetings, we struggle with trying to find funds to go to meetings ourselves, right? So when you're talking about other people and community members where the language is a problem, where they don't have access to a lot of different technologies to keep up to date. So then how do you really make sure that that effective participation that we're really looking at is actually truly effective? Otherwise you'll have people coming in. But yeah, so I think for meaningful participation, capacity building, information access, but also I think we need mobilizing more funds and resources for seeing how can we really do this in a simpler format that the whole of society actually understands, things like NBSAPs. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Tina. Ben, you mentioned earlier about OSCH guideline for NBSAP. What is insight about the participation in the OSCH guideline?
I'll have to share the link so our audience can read and find out. But no, I mean, the guidance focuses on a number of different elements, and that includes process itself, development, and what I'll start with maybe is actually having in place a process under law or policy of a state or other actor that creates a space that is accessible, that addresses certain barriers like language, cultural differences, access to knowledge and information, that addresses power imbalances in terms of the ways that people are able to participate and who else is in the room with them when they're doing so. And so a real effective, meaningful, informed, active participation requires careful thought and resources, right? It's not something you can't just post an NBSAP on the web for 30 days and send out a call for inputs and say we've consulted. You really have to have meaningful discussions and a process in place that allows input. And then it goes past that, right? It goes into the implementation, the monitoring and reporting, and follow-up. And so participatory monitoring and reporting and planning processes are all critical when thinking about how to make the development of a national biodiversity strategy and action plan inclusive and how to ensure that it's more effective. And that's maybe where I want to end, just again referencing the work of these science policy, intergovernmental science policy platforms, both for biodiversity and climate change that have affirmed that having an inclusive and participatory process leads to more effective and sustainable outcomes. So, it's both a matter of human rights obligation, but it's also a matter of better policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks to everyone, the three, for sharing the reaction from the poll. But now I would like to hear from our audience as well. I would like to open the floor and ask if you have a quick or burning questions to our experts here. If you would like to ask the question or share any comment or feedback or insights to our panelists, please raise your hand or please type your question in the chat box. The floor is open. I don't see any hands yet, but we have asked you during the registration to submit the question in advance. So actually we already get a question already, and I want to pick the most difficult question then. There is one question submit during the registration, and anyone can answer this question if it's like related to you. The question is very short: how to convince our government officials about biodiversity? Very simple question, very short, but difficult. Who want to go first? Yeah.
Let me take a shot at it. Okay, well, just from our experience, right, what we have done, it is challenging, but also, like, I think what both Ben and Sue talked about also is access to information. So just as a guidance, is that one of the things that we've really been working around the CBD is working with many of the parties to the CBD. And one way, if you would want to reach out, we do that very regularly, regardless whether we get responses from them or not, is getting in touch with them. So say, for example, if a CBD focal point, so CBD has got focal points as a main country focal point for the CBD. Now you also have about 34 new gender focal points for the CBD. You also have CBD focal points specifically for Nagoya Protocol or traditional knowledge AJ, not all. So one way that we've been kind of working with them is sending them regular updates, especially if they're country specific, to those targeted our advocacy material to the CBD focal points. And you can find all their emails on the website. So if you go to the CBD gender focal points, and one thing I think I always talked about, maybe just building up on Ben shared also, and actually Surya, you know, both the CBD and the Sustainable Development Goals also have either the volunteer peer review, VNRs, and also in the CBD you have the previous NBSAPs. So one way that we've actually kind of convinced parties, say for example putting gender on the global status or looking at national gender target, was to review and also educate ourselves of what the priorities of the specific parties were, especially on the gender. And we reviewed the NBSAPs of the countries, and we tried to target some of those concerns. But it's like I said, but I think I will say that when you're talking about influencing it, the influence takes a very long time. It's taken us over many years to be able to come where we are right now, but it's a process. So I know it's challenging at times, but I would say just keep working on it, and hopefully some day it may possibly have impact. It has worked for us. So I will also share that it has also worked where we have continuously did that for outcomes to show after maybe 6 years, but slow but surely.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear Surya's view, because you have been working as the UN expert for many years. How to convince the government?
I mean, there are many tools, but one thing which I would like to see done more is that the biodiversity has to be part of the political discourse. When the elections are being contested and fought, and different political parties are taking positions, so I think it will be critical to bring biodiversity issues as part of the political discourse, in my view, whether these are green parties or even more progressive parties on that. In addition to that, I think a powerful advocacy tool could be to make short 60-second videos. 30 seconds will capture the environment within which the government officials, ministers, and politicians are living. Because normally these politicians and government officials all over the world, they live in nice places where biodiversity is preserved very nicely. So 30 seconds to document that, and the other 30 seconds to document how the projects that they approve, development projects often, how that project is impacting biodiversity negatively. So the contrast between what these government officials and politicians and decision makers are enjoying for themselves as biodiversity, but then their decisions are impacting biodiversity. I think that could be a very powerful advocacy tool to show this contrast. But of course, working behind the scene and using the power of persuasion, making a case that why biodiversity matters. So I think there are many things we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sriya. Ben, so as the UN agencies, how can we convince the government?
Yeah, thanks so much. Look, I think there's a lot of different ways to try to persuade people of things. There's not one size fits all kind of solution. A couple of things I'll flag. You should come equipped with as many different arguments and kinds of arguments as you can. So for some people, the science policy discourse is really influential. For others, it might be religious or spiritual or ethical arguments. And for others, it might be legal arguments. And certainly that's more my domain than the other aspects. But you should try to be prepared to talk about things in terms that the person you are talking to will relate to. And you should also, I think, recognize that governments are composed of people. And it's often the case that there can be a delegate in a government that is theoretically supportive of a human rights-based approach to biodiversity action that will be a barrier to what we want to do, and vice versa. There can be a delegate representing a government that has strong positions against certain human rights language or arguments, but that will actually help get things done. So I think it's really important too, just to recognize it's about the people to a large extent, and trying to understand and relate to them and find the things that are driving them and the arguments that will be most persuasive to them, and not discounting anybody or counting on anybody based on the delegation that they represent. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We just received a question from Deepika from Australian National University on the effective, meaningful participation. She was wondering whether participation is about having a seat at the table, or does it involve active, meaningful cooperation among institutions, community, state, and others in biodiversity conservation? I would love to hear for the panel to talk a bit on the role of cooperation in decision making. Anyone want to take a first answer, first response about cooperation in decision making?
Let me start quickly, and I think cooperation is crucial, but the question is that the cooperation has to be co-creation based model. So we are trying to co-create solutions together. Cooperation between the governments, businesses, civil society, UN agencies is needed. So cooperation is there. But the point is that we need to cooperate for something where we have a shared common goal. Because cooperation need not always result in tangible, positive human rights friendly outcomes. So I think we need to ensure that the cooperation is principle-based. There's a transparency. The participation is fair. Everyone has a seat on the table, including marginalized communities. And I think that cooperation is going to result in some tangible outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben or Tina, would you like to respond to this question? Any take, any insight from you?
Sure, before Ben, maybe. Yeah, sure. No, I think what once again has already been said. Just to kind of complement is I definitely believe that having a seat at the table is an important value, right? So if you're talking about indigenous peoples, it's not like others, of course, cooperation and getting people do that, collating information, saying, okay, we want to take it forward. But when we are talking about participation in meetings, including of women, we have the understanding that we need to be creating that space in the decision-making spaces like the CBD to bring in those community representatives to share their lived experiences to inform decision-making. And I think it is really important that everybody who are relevant stakeholders get a seat at the table. Yeah, I'm just going to, yeah, you have to have a seat at the table.
Ben?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first heard cooperation, I immediately started thinking about human rights obligations related to international cooperation, and in order to fulfill human rights and sort of technical means and means of implementation and resources. But in terms of cooperation in decision making, I mean, what I would say is that decision making that is participatory and inclusive, by definition, is a cooperative process, right? It's involving and hearing from different actors, and from our perspective, it needs to ensure the free, active, meaningful participation of rights holders. So that cooperative decision-making process really should be about finding the decision point that respects, protects, and fulfills human rights in consultation with rights holders in order to move forward. And to the extent that that doesn't happen, which is, I think, in many cases, we're really not having an effective decision-making process, or one that is aligned with human rights.
Thank you. I think I just saw the hand raised once. I'm not sure if our audience want to ask the question. Otherwise, we want our webinar to be short and sweet, so we intend for only 1 hour, but the time flies so fast. But
okay.
Yes,
Just some remarks, because I'm Dunia Khouri from Lebanon. I'm founder and president of NGO, and as well I'm member of the Weekend Initiative of the FAO, which is joining the women of the South to support each other. I think that one of the it's a must to work on, and we already have a meeting for all conventions, the 3 conventions, speaking about women's right to the land. This is a very important issue, and we have to tackle all together to be able to implement this human right. It's human right, but it is about land, it is about desertification, it is about biodiversity. So we need to have this right, the woman's right to the land. It's different from one country to the other. This is why we have to go through the decision makers, and we need to have the woman as decision maker. And it was one of the action plan during the COP15 in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan. We spoke about women in decision making. So this is a rule where we can also support each other, the UN organizations. I am from the NGOs with other parties that can support and have the right to women to the land, the right of women to the land. Thank you so much. Thank you for this meeting, and happy Biodiversity Day.
Thank you. Happy Biodiversity Day. Any quick reaction to Duni? If not, I would like to hear 1 minute from you, your call to action to any stakeholders you want to send a message or last insight on Biodiversity Day. You all have only 1 minute, please. I start with Tina.
Thanks, Ramchat. No, also as being co-organizers for this webinar, I also want to extend my thanks to Surya and Ben for joining, but also Ramchat. This was really interesting, and hopefully our panel, all our participants found this engaging and interesting. Happy International Biodiversity Day. For me or for Women for Biodiversity, we really do hope that we can bring those policies together. I think that's one core element that we are always working on, is building synergies and looking for allies. Like we talked about, that it's not a one person, one organization movement, but to really push in those, talk about advocacy or spaces of participation, we need to really come together. So I just want to say that is whether we talk about harmony with nature or transformative change and leaving no one behind, or, we need to really make sure that we come together and have an open space of sharing. And I think if we do that, I know it can be challenging at times, but I still have hope that we will achieve something good in the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Ben, last remarks for you from your side.
Yeah, thank you. A privilege to be here today, and a really interesting discussion. There are so many things that people can do, and all of us can do, and so I'd really just encourage you to find the one that works for you. Whether that be voting, donating, teaching, talking to your colleagues, examining your own sort of consumer behavior, advocating with your government, but learn something about the right to a healthy environment today, and step outside today and actually enjoy nature. Try to be inspired and find the best way for you to be part of this push to protect people and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, please.
It was a wonderful exchange, so thank you for having me on this webinar. I will say we need to break silos in terms of policy making, whether it is happening at the national level or international level. We have separate COP for biodiversity, climate change is separate, sustainable development goals, we're talking in the HLPF, human rights is separate, environment is separate, plastic pollution is separate, So there's a lot of parallel things happening in the world, and we are not making enough connections, in my view, and interlinkages. And I believe very strongly that the human rights should be the cross-cutting thread into all of these processes. That should underpin everything that we are building, whether it's a climate change or biodiversity or plastic pollution or sustainable development. Human rights, all human rights for everyone, everywhere, should be the foundation. And we should work together collectively to achieve these goals in these very challenging times. That's my message. Thank you.
Thank you. And Surya message really linked to my special video as well, because we received a special video from the UN Special Rapporteur on climate change that just shared with us. So I just do 1 hour ago, so it's a surprise for everyone, but this is a special video for the UN Special Rapporteurs on human rights and climate change. So let's see her video and her message together. And please confirm if you see.
Let's be grateful also for how nature keeps regulating our climate. Happy International Biodiversity Day. Let's be grateful for the role of all living organisms, visible and invisible to us, on land and in the soil, in the air, in freshwater bodies and in the ocean, for the whole web of life and how it supports our life on this planet. Let's be grateful also for how nature keeps regulating our climate. And let's reflect on how we cannot afford for any climate response measure to cause severe negative impacts on biodiversity, because that in itself would make our climate system less safe. It would also worsen the climate change impacts on human rights, particularly those of persons and communities in most vulnerable situations. And it would undermine everyone's resilience and adaptive capacities to respond to climate change impacts. And finally, let us imagine how we can transform our economies and societies by protecting and restoring ecosystems and human connections with nature, including through access to justice and effective remedies for the harm that has already been caused to the climate system. Human connections with nature support our physical and mental health as individuals and in communities, and they bring us together across generations in alliances working towards a safer climate for all. I hope you can enjoy today and every day all the gifts that biodiversity brings to us.
Thank you. So this is a special video and really listeners to what Surya just mentioned, breaking the silo. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I thank to you, Ben, Tina, and Surya, and all the participants for engaging with this vital discussion. The insight shared today reinforce the agencies of protecting biodiversity while ensuring human rights remain at the core of conservation policies. To continue this conversation, follow UN Human Rights and Women for Biodiversity and stay engaged in the upcoming dialogues. I wishing you all a meaningful and inspiring International Day for Biological Diversity. Thank you and see you soon.
Wait, Romchat, sorry, I'm interrupting. Can we just stay on for a few seconds just for a virtual photo?
Sure.
I would request everybody to open your cameras, please,
Yes,
if that's
please
okay.
open your camera. Yes. Can we say together, Happy Biodiversity Day? Thank you.
Sumina, let us know when you've got everybody on screen. So
Yes, I am doing it. Sorry. Okay, just one
happy
more,
International
please.
Biodiversity Day.
Happy Biodiversity Day.
Smile, everybody.
Happy Biodiversity Day. Bye for now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You got the photo?
Yes, I got it. Thank you, everybody. Happy
Thank you.
Biodiversity Day.
Thank you so much for joining
Ciao.
me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.